Reason and Revolution by Herbert Marcuse. This is the conclusion, the end of Hegelianism. 1. British neo-idealism. Hegel's philosophy held to the progressive ideas in Western rationalism and worked out their historical destiny. It attempted to light up the right of reason and its power amid the developing antagonisms of modern society. There was a dangerous element in this philosophy, dangerous to the existing order, that is, which derived from its use of the standard of reason to analyze the form of the state. Hegel endorsed the state only insofar as it was rational, that is, insofar as it preserved and promoted individual freedom and the social potencies of men. Hegel attached the realization of reason to a definite historical order, namely the sovereign national state that had emerged on the continent with the liquidation of the French Revolution. In so doing, he submitted his philosophy to a decisive historical test, for any basic change that might take place in this order would have to alter the relation between Hegel's ideas and the existing social and political forms. This means, for example, that when civil society develops forms of organization that deny the essential rights of the individual and abolish the rational state, the Hegelian philosophy must clash with this new state. On its side, the state will then also repudiate Hegel's philosophy. One final test exists for this conclusion, that to be found to the fascist and national socialist attitudes to Hegel. That to be found in the fascist and national socialist attitudes to Hegel. These state philosophies exemplify the abolition of the rational standard and the individual freedom on which Hegel's glorification of the state depended. There can be no meeting ground between them and Hegel. And yet, ever since the First World War, when the system of liberalism began to shape into the system of authoritarianism, a widespread opinion has blamed Hegelianism for the ideological preparation of the new system. We quote, for example, the dedication to L.T. Hobhouse's important book, The Metaphysical Theory of the State. In the bombing of London, I had just witnessed the visible and tangible outcome of a false and wicked doctrine, the foundations of which lay, as I believe, in the book before me, Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind. With that work began the most penetrating and subtle of all intellectual influences, which have sapped the rational humanitarianism of the 18th and 19th centuries, and in the Hegelian theory of the God-state, all that I had witnessed lay implicit. We shall later note the curious fact that the official defenders of the National Socialist state reject Hegel precisely on the ground of his rational humanitarianism. To decide more fully who is right in this controversy, however, we must sketch the role of Hegelianism in the later period of liberalist society. In Germany, the representative social and political philosophy of the last half of the 19th century remained anti-Hegelian, or at best indifferent to Hegel. There were, however, apart from the employment of Hegelian philosophy and the Marxian theory, two great renaissances of Hegelianism, one in England, the other in Italy. The British movement was still connected with the principles and philosophy of liberalism, and for this very reason lay much closer to the spirit of Hegel than did the Italian. The latter movement was drawing nearer to the approaching current of fascism, and was therefore becoming more and more of a caricature of Hegel's philosophy, especially in the case of Gentile. At first glance, the tendencies in the British and Italian Hegelianism seemed to bear out Hobhouse's interpretation. The political philosophy of the British idealists seized upon the anti-liberal ideas and Hegel's philosophy of right. From T.H. Green to Bernard Bosanquet, the crescendo of emphasis fell increasingly upon the independent principle of the state and on the preeminence of the universal. The social interests of free individuals on which the liberalist tradition had relied for its construction of the state were disregarded. The state, according to Green, is based on an ideal principle of its own, and the common good which the state embodies and guards cannot result from the free play of individual interests. There are no individual rights separate from the universal right represented by the state. To ask why I am to submit to the power of the state is to ask why I am to allow my life to be regulated by that complex of institutions without which I literally should not have a life to call my own, nor should be able to ask for a justification of what I am called to do. Green comes much closer to the inner motives of Hegel's philosophy when he attempts to understand this universal as a historical force that operates through the deeds and passions of men. In the state, the actions of men whom in themselves we reckon bad are overruled for good, made to depend not on individual passion and motive, but in some measure on the struggle of mankind toward perfection. The tendencies in Green to reify the universal as against the individual are counteracted by his adherence to the progressive tendencies of Western rationalism. He insists throughout his work that the state be submitted to rational standards, such as imply that the common good is best served through advancing the interests of free individuals. He grants men the right to dispute laws that violate their just claim to determine their own will, but he demands that all claims against the existing order must be founded on a reference to an acknowledged social good. Far from being an apology for authoritarianism, Green's political philosophy can, in a certain sense, be designated as a super-liberalism. The general principle that the citizen must never act otherwise than as a citizen does not carry with it an obligation under all conditions to conform to the law of a state, since those laws may be inconsistent with the true end of the state as the sustainer and harmonizer of social relations. Green thus grants to every individual qua citizen the liberty to assert an illegal right, provided that its exercise should be contributory to some social good which the public conscience is capable of appreciating. He has no doubt that there is such a thing as a public conscience, always open to rational conviction and always willing to permit truth to progress. The material arena in which the common good has to be realized is not the state as such, but this or that particular state, which might perhaps not fulfill the purpose of a true state, and therefore have to be swept away and superseded by another. Hence, there is no ground for holding that a state is justified in doing whatever its interests seem to require. In contrast to Hegel, Green holds war, even just war, to be a wrong against the individual's right to life and liberty. And in opposition to Hegel's fundamental concept of supreme sovereignty of the national state, Green envisages an overarching organization of mankind, which through an increase in the free scope of the individual and an expansion of free trade will make the motives and occasions of international conflict tend to disappear. The point has sometimes been made that the development of British idealism from Green to Bossuet was one in which the rationalist and liberalist ideas of earlier days were slowly abandoned. We might venture to add to this a corollary. The more Hegelian in wording this idealism became, the further it removed itself from the true spirit of Hegel's thought. Bradley's metaphysics, notwithstanding its Hegelian concepts, has a strong irrationalist core that is entirely alien to Hegel. Bossuet's philosophical theory of the state has features that make the individual a victim of the hypostasized state universal, so characteristic of the later fascist ideology. The average individual is no longer accepted as the real self or individuality. The center of gravity is thrown outside him. Outside him means to Bossuet, outside his own private interest and amusement, outside the sphere of his immediate want and desire. From its beginnings, this renaissance of idealism showed a definite anti-materialist tendency, a quality it shares with the tendencies accompanying the transition from liberalism to authoritarianism. The ideology accompanying this movement prepared the individual for more labor and less enjoyment, a slogan of the authoritarian economy. Gratification of individual wants had to give way before duties to the whole. The duties as they came were found to jibe less and less with any rational standard, and the more true this situation became, the greater stress was laid on the doctrine that the individual's relation to the whole was a relation between two ideal entities that overrule his empirical existence. We see that there is a meaning in the suggestion that our self, or that our real self, or individuality may be something which in one sense we are not, but which we recognize as imperative upon us. Liberty for the individual can be realized only through obedience to the imperative. It is vested in the state which, as the guardian of our real self, is the instrument of our greatest self-affirmation. The juxtaposition of a real and an empirical self is an ambiguity. It might refer to a significant dualism, to the actual distress of men in their empirical reality as against a real self that demands fulfillment for need and a remedy of distress. On the other hand, the same conception may signify a deprecation of the empirical life in favor of an unconditionally ideal life of the state. Bosanquet's political philosophy runs from one to the other of these two poles. He adopts Rousseau's revolutionary principle of compulsory education towards freedom, but in the course of discussion, the goal, freedom, dissolves before the compulsory means. Force, automatism, and suggestion are the very conditions for progress in intellect. In promoting the best life, these aids must be employed by society as exercising absolute power by the state. The realization of the best life is the end set by state and society, but that end is so far overshadowed by the element of force involved in its attainment. Fucking lost my spot already. That the state must be defined as a unit recognized as rightly exercising control over its members through absolute physical power, or recognized as a unit lawfully exercising force. Hobhouse replies to this definition that it can properly fit into the scheme of any authoritarian absolutism. The question may not be answered how far the political theory of these British neo-idealists constitutes a genuine resumption of the Hegelian philosophy. One original motive of German idealism that certainly retained, idealism they certainly retained, namely that true liberty cannot be achieved through the mindset and daily practice of isolated individuals in the competitive vortex of modern society. Freedom is rather a condition to be sought beyond in the state. The state alone fulfills their real wills and their real selves. Hegel thought that the particular kind of state that could serve this purpose was the one that retained the decisive achievements of the French Revolution and incorporated them into a rational whole. When the British idealists elaborated their political doctrine, it was at least obvious that the historical form of the state that had come upon the scene was by no means the realization of freedom and reason. The great merit of Hobhouse's book lies in its exposure of the incompatibility between Hegel's conception and the material basis of the existing state. He points to the fact that Bosanquet's philosophy yields the individual into the clutches of a society as such, or to the state generally, whereas in reality the individual always has to carry on his life in some particular historical form of society and state. This central fallacy is of the utmost importance, for in it is implied the confusion between contingent power relations and moral obligations. State and society as they are cannot claim the dignity of being reason's embodiment. When we think of the actual inconsistencies of traditional social morality, the blindness and crudity of law, the elements of class selfishness and oppression that have colored it, we are inclined to say that no mere philosopher, but only the social satirist, could treat this conception as it deserves. To those who hold abstractly to Hegel's political philosophy, Hobhouse replies that the very fact of class society, the patient influence of class interests on the state, renders it impossible to designate the state as expressive of the real will of individuals as a whole. Wherever a community is governed by one class or one race, the remaining class or race is permanently in the position of having to take what it can get. To say that institutions of such a society express the private will of the subject class is merely to add insult to injury. In place of concern for the universal, Hobhouse puts concern for the actual welfare of the individual in place of the Weltgeist, the infinite number of human lives irretrievably lost, If the world cannot be made incomparably better than it has hitherto been, then the struggle has no issue, and we had better strengthen the doctrine of the militant state and arm it with enough high explosive to bring life to an end. Insistence on man's claim to universal happiness, which is always happiness for each, so frequently found in the pages of Hobhouse's book, renders it one of the great documents of liberalist philosophy. The happiness and misery of societies, the happiness and misery of human beings, heightened or deepened by its sense of common possession. Its will is their wills. Its will is their wills in the conjoint result. Its conscience is an expression of what is noble or ignoble in them when the balance is struck. If we may judge each man by the contribution he makes to the community, we are equally right to ask of the community what it is doing for this man. The greatest happiness will not be realized by the greatest or any great number, unless in a form in which all can share, in which indeed the sharing is for each an essential ingredient. But there is no happiness at all except that experienced by individual men and women, and there is no common self submerging the soul of men. There are societies in which their distinct and separate personalities may develop in harmony and contribute to a collective achievement. Hobhouse is, of course, right as against the neo-idealists, just as liberalism is right as against any irrational hypostasis of the state that disregards the fate of the individual. On the other hand, the demands that Hobhouse advances are in line with the abstract principles of liberalism, but they conflict with the concrete form that liberalist society took. Hegel once defined liberalism as the social philosophy that sticks to the abstract and is always defeated by the concrete. The principles of liberalism are valid. The common interest cannot be other in the last analysis than the product of the multitude of freely developing individual selves in society. But the concrete forms of society that have developed since the 19th century have increasingly frustrated the freedom to which liberalism counsels allegiance. Under the laws that govern the social process, the free play of private initiative has wound up in competition among monopolies for the most part. An era of cutthroat competition followed by a rapid process of amalgamation threw an enormous quantity of wealth into the hands of a small number of captains of industry. No luxury of living to which this class could attain kept pace with its rise of income, and a process of automatic saving set in upon an unprecedented scale. The investment of these savings in other industries helped to bring these under the same concentrative forces. In the free competition of manufacturers preceding combination, the chronic condition is one of overproduction in the sense that all the mills or factories can only be kept at work by cutting prices down towards a point where the weaker competitors are forced to close down because they cannot sell their goods at a price which covers the true cost of production. Bosanquet's philosophical theory of the state appeared when this transition from liberal to monopolistic capitalism had already begun. Social theory was faced with the alternative either of abandoning the principles of liberalism so that the existing social order might be maintained, or of fighting the system in order to preserve the principles. The latter choice was implied in the Marxian theory of society. 2. The revision of the dialectic. The Marxian theory, however, had itself begun to undergo fundamental changes. The history of Marxism has confirmed the affinity between Hegel's motives and the critical interest of the materialist dialectic as applied to society. The schools of Marxism that abandoned the revolutionary foundations of the Marxian theory were the same that outspokenly repudiated the Hegelian aspects of the Marxian theory, especially the dialectic. Revisionist writing and thought, which expressed the growing faith of large socialist groups in a peaceful evolution from capitalism to socialism, attempted to change socialism from a theoretical and practical antithesis to the capitalist system into a parliamentary movement within this system. The philosophy and politics of opportunism, represented by this movement, took the form of a struggle against what it termed the remnants of utopian thinking in Marx. The result was that revisionism replaced the critical dialectic conception with the conformist attitudes of naturalism. Bowing to the authority of the facts, which indeed justified the hopes of a legal parliamentary opposition, revisionism diverted revolutionary action into the channel of a faith in the necessary natural evolution to socialism. The dialectic, in consequence, was termed the treacherous element in the Marxian doctrine, the trap that is laid for all consistent thinking. Bernstein declares that the snare of dialectic consists in its inappropriate abstraction from the specific particularities of things. He defended the matter-of-fact quality of fixed and stable objects as against any notion of their dialectical negation. If we wish to comprehend the world, we have to conceive it as a complex of ready-made objects and processes. This amounted to the revival of common sense as the organon of knowledge. The dialectical overthrow of the fixed and stable had been undertaken in the interest of a higher truth that might dissolve the negative totality of ready-made objects and processes. This revolutionary interest was now renounced in favor of the secure and stable given state of affairs that, according to revisionism, slowly evolves toward a rational society. The class interest recedes, the common interest grows in power. At the same time, legislation becomes increasingly more powerful and regulates the struggle of economic forces, governing increasingly more realms which were previously left to the blind war of particular interests. With the repudiation of the dialectic, the revisionists falsified the nature of the laws that Marx saw ruling society. We recall Marx's view that the natural laws of society gave expression to the blind and irrational processes of capitalist reproduction, and that the socialist revolution was to bring emancipation from these laws. In contrast to this, the revisionists argue that the social laws are natural laws that guarantee the inevitable development towards socialism. The great achievement of Marx and Engels lay in the fact that they had better success than their predecessors in weaving the realm of history into the realm of necessity, and thus elevating history to the rank of a science. The critical Marxist theory the revisionists thus tested by the standards of positivist sociology and transformed into natural science. In line with the inner tendencies of the positivist reaction against negative philosophy, the objective conditions that prevail were hypostasized, and human practice was rendered subordinate to their authority. Those anxious to preserve the critical import of the Marxian doctrine saw in the anti-dialectical trends not only a theoretical deviation, but a serious political danger that threatened the success of socialist action at every turn. To them, the dialectical method, with its uncompromising spirit of contradiction, was the essential without which the critical theory of society would of necessity become a neutral or positivist sociology. And since there existed an intrinsic connection between Marxian theory and practice, the transformation of the theory would result in a neutral or positivist attitude to the existing societal form. Plekhanov emphatically announced that without dialectic, the materialist theory of knowledge and practice is incomplete, one-sided, nay more, it is impossible. The method of dialectic is a totality wherein the negation and destruction of the existing appears in every concept, thus furnishing the full conceptual framework for understanding the entirety of the existing order in accordance with the interest of freedom. Dialectical analysis alone can provide an adequate orientation for revolutionary practice, for it prevents this practice from being overwhelmed by the interests and aims of an opportunist philosophy. Lenin insisted on dialectical method to such an extent that he considered it the hallmark of revolutionary Marxism. While discussing the most urgent practical political matters, he indulged in analyses of the significance of the dialectic. The most striking example is to be found in his examination of Trotsky's and Bukharin's theses for the Trade Union Conference, written on January 25, 1921. In this tract, Lenin shows how a poverty of dialectical thinking may lead to grave political errors, and he links his defense of dialectic to an attack on the naturalist misinterpretation of Marxian theory. The dialectical conception he shows is incompatible with any reliance upon the natural necessity of economic laws. It is furthermore incompatible with the exclusive orientation of the revolutionary movement to economic ends, because all economic ends receive their meaning and content only from the totality of the new social order to which this movement is directed. Lenin regarded those who subordinated political aims and spontaneity to the purely economic struggle to be among the most dangerous falsifiers of Marxian theory. He held against these Marxists the absolute predominance of politics over economics. Politics cannot have precedence over economics. To argue differently means forgetting the ABC of Marxism. 3. Fascist Hegelianism. While the heritage of Hegel and the dialectic was being defended only by the radical wing among the Marxists, at the opposite pole of political thought, a revival of Hegelianism was taking place that brings us to the threshold of fascism. The Italian neo-idealism was from the outset associated with the movement for national unification and later with the drive to strengthen the nationalist state against its imperialist competitors. The fact that the ideology of the young national state looked to Hegelian philosophy for its support is to be explained by the particular historical development in Italy. In its first phase, Italian nationalism had to contend with the Catholic Church, which regarded the Italian aspirations as detrimental to Vatican interests. The Protestant tendencies of German idealism provided efficient weapons for the justification of a secular authority in the struggle with the Church. Furthermore, Italy's entry among the imperialist powers brought in an extremely backward national economy, with the middle class split into numerous competing groups, hardly fit to cope with the growing antagonisms that accompany the adaptation of this economy to modern industrial expansion. Croce, as well as Gentile, emphasized that a petty positivism and materialism held sway, which made people feel satisfied with their small private interests and unable to understand the far-reaching sweep of nationalist aims. The state had to assert its imperialist interest under frequent opposition from the middle class. Also, it had yet to achieve what other national states had already achieved: an efficient bureaucracy, a centralized administration, a rationalized industry, and a complete military preparedness against the external and internal enemy. This positive task of the state made Italian neo-idealism lean towards the Hegelian position. The turn towards Hegel's conception was an ideological maneuver against the weakness of Italian liberalism. Sergio Panunzio, the official theoretician of the fascist state, has shown that ever since Mazzini, Italian political philosophy was predominantly anti-liberal and anti-individualist. This philosophy found in Hegel a congenial demonstration of the state as an independent substance, existing vis-a-vis the petty interests of the middle class. Panunzio endorses Hegel's distinction between state and civil society, and with it his remarks on the corporation, saying that those writers are right who relate so many aspects of the fascist state to Hegel's organic state. Italian idealism, however, was Hegelian only where it confined itself to expounding Hegel's philosophy. Spaventa and above all, Croce made essential contributions to a new understanding of Hegel's system. Croce's logic and aesthetics were attempts at a genuine revival of Hegelian thought. In contrast, the political exploitation of Hegel renounced the fundamental interests of his philosophy. Moreover, the closer Italian idealism grew to fascism, the more it deviated from Hegelianism, even in the field of theoretical philosophy. Gentile's main philosophical works are a logic and a philosophy of mind. Although he also wrote Riforma della dialettica hegeliana, proclaiming the mind as the only reality, his philosophy, when judged by its content and not its language, has nothing to do with Hegel's. The central conception of the theory of mind as pure act from 1916 might remotely resemble Kant's notion of the transcendental consciousness, but this resemblance, too, is in the wording rather than the meaning. We shall in our discussion limit ourselves to this work. Though it appeared long before the triumph of fascism, it shows most clearly the affinity between Italian neo-idealism and this authoritarian system, and provides a lesson as to what happens to a philosophy that fosters such affinity. One important truth applies to both Gentile's works and to the later utterances of fascist philosophy. They cannot be treated on a philosophic level. Comprehension and knowledge are made part of the course of political practice, not on any rational grounds, but because no truth is recognized apart from such practice. Philosophy is no longer declared to hold its truth in opposition to an untrue social practice, nor is philosophy supposed to agree only with such practice as is directed towards realizing reason. Gentile proclaims practice, no matter what form it may be taking, to be the truth as such. According to him, the sole reality is the act of thinking. Any assumption of a natural and historical world separate from and outside this act is denied. The object is thus resolved into the subject, and any opposition between thinking and doing or between mind and reality becomes meaningless. For thinking, which is making, real doing, is ipso facto true. The true is what is in the making. Recasting a sentence from Giambattista Vico, Gentile writes, Verum e fieri convertantur, and he sums up, the concept of truth coincides with the concept of fact. There can be few statements more remote from Hegel's spirit. Despite his many assertions about the reality of mind, Gentile can be considered neither a Hegelian nor an idealist. His philosophy is much closer to positivism. The approach of the authoritarian state seems to announce itself in an attitude that submits all too readily to the authority of matters of fact. An integral part of totalitarian control is the attack on critical and independent thought. The appeal to facts is substituted for the appeal to reason. No reason can sanction a regime that uses the greatest productive apparatus man has ever created in the interest of an increasing restriction of human satisfactions. No reason except the fact that the economic system can be retained in no other way. Just as the fascist emphasis on action and change prevents the insights into the necessity of rational courses of action and change, Gentile's deification of thinking prevents the liberation of thought from the shackles of the given. The fact of brute power becomes the real God of the time, and as that power enhances itself, the surrender of thought to the fact shows forth the more. Lawrence Dennis, in his recent book Defending Fascist Policy, shows the same abdication of thought when he advocates a scientific and logical method, the governing assumption of which will be that facts are normative, that is to say, facts should determine rules, being paramount to rules. A rule which contradicts a fact is nonsense. Gentile discards the fundamental principle of all idealism, namely, that there is an antagonism and strain between truth and fact, between thought or mind and reality. His whole theory is based upon the immediate identity of these polar elements, whereas Hegel's point had been that there is no such immediate identity, but only the dialectical process of achieving it. Before we outline some of the implications of the new philosophy of mind, we must review the factors that brought to Gentile the reputation of being an idealist philosopher. We shall find them in his use of Kant's transcendental ego. According to Gentile, the statement that the pure act of thinking is the only reality does not apply to the empirical, but only to the transcendental I. All the qualifications of mind, its developing unity, its identity with its immediate manifestations, its being free, and the principle of space, etc., refer only to its transcendental activity. The distinction between empirical and transcendental ego and the description of the transcendental point of view follow Kant's pattern with fair accuracy, but the use of which Gentile puts the conception destroys the very meaning of transcendental idealism. The latter had assumed that a reality is given to consciousness, but cannot be resolved into it. The reception of sense data is the condition for the spontaneous acts of pure understanding. Hegel, too, although he rejected the Kantian notion of a thing in itself, did not abandon the objective foundations of transcendental idealism. His principle of mediation retained them. The realization of mind was the continued working out of a process between reason and reality. Gentile, on the other hand, claims to have got rid of the illusion of a natural reality. We do not suppose as a logical antecedent of knowledge the reality which is the object of knowledge. We cancel that independent nature of the world, which makes it appear the basis of mind, by recognizing that it is only an abstract moment of mind. Kant's transcendental ego was distinguished by its unique relations to a pre-given reality. When this reality is cancelled, the transcendental ego must, despite all assertions to the contrary, remain a mere word that obtains a certain meaning only by a generalization from the empirical ego. With the destruction of the objective barrier, man is delivered into a world supposedly his own, real only as his own act and doing. The individual is the real positive, and all that is posited by us. To be sure, it is positive only insofar as we oppose it to ourselves, recognize it not as our work, but that of others. But the opposition will dissolve as soon as we see that the individual, by virtue of the transcendental consciousness, is also the universal. The individual makes itself and the universal is the self-making of the universal. Behind this rather confused heap of words, a significant process is working itself out, a process of breakdown for all rational laws and standards, an exaltation of action regardless of the goal, a veneration of success. In a sense, Gentile's philosophy retains the slight traces of the liberalist scheme in which idealism originated, especially in its insistence that the individual is the only positive. But this individuality, oscillating between the meaningless, transcendental, and the empty concrete, has no other content than action. Its entire essence resolves into its acts, which have no supra-individual laws to restrain them, and no valid principles to judge them. Gentile himself calls his doctrine absolute formalism. There is no matter apart from the pure form of acting. The only matter there is in the spiritual act, is the form itself and as activity. The only matter there is in the spiritual act is the form itself as activity. There. Gentile's doctrine that true reality is action justified in itself clearly enunciates and glorifies the conscious and programmatic lawlessness of fascist action. The mind itself in its actuality is withdrawn from every pre-established law and cannot be defined as a being restricted to a definite nature in which the process of life is exhausted and completed. From the Hegelian dialectic, Gentile borrows the idea that reality is a ceaseless process, but the process, detached from any pattern of universal reason, produces a wholesale destruction rather than any construction of the rational forms of life. True life is made one by death. Hegel's philosophy weaves the transitory nature of all historical forms into the world historical web of reason and progress. The content of the transitory is still present at the final inauguration of freedom. Gentile's actualism is entirely indifferent to reason and greets the prevailing evil and deficiency as a great good. Our mind's real need is not that error and evil should disappear from the world, but that they should be eternally present. For there is no truth without error, and no good without evil. Notwithstanding, then, the paradoxical interpretation of reality as mind, Gentile accepts the world as it is and deifies its horrors. Finite things, whatever and however they may be, are always the very reality of God. The philosophy that eventuates exalts the world into an eternal theogony, which is fulfilled in the inwardness of our being. This inwardness, however, is no longer a refuge from a miserable reality, but justifies the final dissolution of all objective norms and values into the disorder of pure action. All its fundamental motives show Gentiles to be the strict opposite of Hegel's philosophy, and it is by virtue of its being the opposite that it passes directly into the fascist ideology. Identification of thought with action and of reality with mind prevents thought from taking a position opposed to reality. Theory becomes practice to such a degree that all thought is rejected if it is not immediate practice or immediately consummated in action. Gentile's theory of mind praises anti-intellectualism, foreshadowing the typically relativistic traits of fascist philosophy to be noted in the repudiation of all fixed programs that go beyond the requirements of the immediate situation. Action sets its own aims and norms that may not be judged by any objective ends and principles. The Foundations of Fascism, published by Gentile, announced the abolition of all programs to be the very philosophy of fascism. Fascism is bound by no principles, change of course. To keep step with the changing constellations of power is its sole unchanging program. No decision is valid for the future. The true decisions of the deuce are those which are simultaneously formulated and executed. The statement discloses one essential attribute of the authoritarian state, the inconsistency of its ideology. Gentile's actualism asserts the totalitarian rule of practice over thought, the independence of the latter disappearing once and for all. Loyalty to any truth that lies outside or beyond the practical aims of fascist politics is declared meaningless. Theory as such and all intellectual activity are made subservient to the changing requirements of politics. 4. National Socialism versus Hegel. We cannot understand the basic difference between the Hegelian and the fascist idea of the state without sketching the historical foundations of fascist totalitarianism. Hegel's political philosophy was grounded on the assumption that civil society could be kept functioning without renouncing the essential rights and liberties of the individual. Hegel's political theory idealized the Restoration state, but he looked upon it as embodying the lasting achievements of the modern era, namely the German Reformation, the French Revolution, and idealist culture. The totalitarian state, on the other hand, marks the historical stage at which these very achievements become dangerous to the maintenance of civil society. The roots of fascism are traceable to the antagonisms between growing industrial monopolization and the democratic system. In Europe, after the First World War, the highly rationalized and rapidly expanding industrial apparatus met increasing difficulties of utilization, especially because of the disruption of the world market and because of the vast network of social legislation ardently defended by the labor movement. In this situation, the most powerful industrial groups tended to assume direct political power in order to organize monopolistic production, to destroy the socialist opposition, and to resume imperialist expansionism. The emerging political system cannot develop the productive forces without a constant pressure on the satisfaction of human needs. This requires a totalitarian control over all social and individual relations, the abolition of social and individual liberties, and the incorporation of the masses by means of terror. Society becomes an armed camp in the service of those great interests that have survived the economic competitive struggle. The anarchy of the market is removed. Labor becomes compulsory service, and the productive forces are rapidly expanded. But the whole process serves only the interests of the ruling bureaucracy, which constitutes itself the heir of the old capitalist class. The fascist organization of society requires a change in the entire setting of culture, the culture with which German idealism was linked and which lived on until the fascist era, accented private liberties and rights so that the individual, at least as a private person, could feel safe in the state and in society. The total surrender of human life to the vested social and political powers was prevented not only by a system of political representation, legal equality, freedom of contracts, but also by the alleviating influence of philosophy, art, and religion. When Hegel divided man's social life among the family, civil society, and the state, he recognized that each of these historical stages had a relative right of its own. Moreover, he subordinated even the highest stage, the state, to the absolute right of reason asserted in the world history of mind. When fascism finally demolished the liberalist framework of culture, it in effect abolished the last field in which the individual could claim his right against society and the state. Hegel's philosophy was an integral part of the culture, which authoritarianism had to overcome. It is therefore no accident that the National Socialist assault on Hegel begins with the repudiation of his political theory. Alfred Rosenberg, official keeper of National Socialist philosophy, opened the drive on Hegel's concept of the state. As a consequence of the French Revolution, he says, a doctrine of power alien to our blood arose. It reached its apogee with Hegel and was then, in a new falsification, taken over by Marx. This doctrine bestowed upon the state, he continues, the dignity of the absolute and the attribute of an end in itself. To the masses, the state came forth as a soulless instrument of force. The ideological attack of National Socialism upon the Hegelian conception of the state contrasts rather squarely with the Italian fascists' seeming acceptance of it. The difference is to be explained in the different historical situations that the two fascist ideologies had to meet. In contrast to Italy, the German state had been a powerful and firmly established reality, which even the Weimar Republic had not shaken in its foundations. It was a Rechtsstaat, a comprehensive, rational political system with distinctly demarcated and recognized spheres of rights and liberties that could not be utilized by the new authoritarian regime. Moreover, the latter could discard the state form because the economic powers who stood behind the National Socialist movement were long since strong enough to govern directly, without the unnecessary mediation of political forms that would have to grant at least a minimum of legal equality and security. Consequently, Rosenberg, like all the other National Socialist spokesmen, turns against the state and denies its supreme authority. Today we view the state no longer as an independent idol before which men must kneel. The state is not even an end, but is only a means for preserving the people, and the authority of the Volkheit is above that of the state. He who does not admit this fact is an enemy of the people. Carl Schmitt, the leading political philosopher of the Third Reich, likewise rejects the Hegelian position on the state, declaring it incompatible with the substance of National Socialism. Whereas the political philosophy of the last century had been based upon a dichotomy between state and society, National Socialism substitutes the triad of state, movement, the party, and people, Volk. The state is by no means the ultimate political reality in the triad. It is superseded and determined by the movement and its leadership. Alfred Rosenberg's statement sets the stage for the National Socialist rejection of Hegel's political philosophy. He says Hegel belonged to the line of development that produced the French Revolution and the Marxian critique of society. Here, as in many other instances, National Socialism reveals a far deeper understanding of the realities than many of its critics. Hegel's state philosophy held to the progressive ideas of liberalism to such an extent that his political position became incompatible with the totalitarian state of civil society. The state as reason, that is, as a rational whole, governed by universally valid laws, calculable and lucid in its operation, professing to protect the essential interest of every individual without discrimination. This form of state is precisely what National Socialism cannot tolerate. This is the supplementary institution of economic liberalism that had to be crushed as soon as that form of economy went under. The Hegelian triad of family, society, and state has disappeared, and in its place is the overarching unity that devours all pluralism of rights and principles. The government is totalitarian. The individual championed in the Hegelian philosophy, he who bore reason and freedom, is annihilated. The individual, so we teach today, has as such neither the right nor the duty to exist, since all rights and all duties derive only from the community. This community, in turn, is neither the union of free individuals nor the rational whole of the Hegelian state, but the natural entity of the race. National Socialist ideologists emphasized that the community to which the individual is completely subordinate constitutes a natural reality bound together by blood and soil and subject to no rational norms or values. The focusing upon natural conditions serves to divert attention from the social and economic basis of totalitarianism. The Volksgemeinschaft is idolized as a natural community precisely because and insofar as there is no actual social community. Since the social relations demonstrate the lack of any community, the Volksgemeinschaft has to be set apart in the dimension of blood and soil, which does not hamper the real play of class interests within society. The elevation of the Volk to the position of the original and ultimate political entity shows once again how distant National Socialism is from the Hegelian conception. According to Hegel, the Volk is that part of the state that does not know its own will. This attitude of Hegel's, though it may seem a reactionary one, is closer to freedom's interests than the popular radicalism of the National Socialist utterances. Hegel rejects any notion that the people are an independent political factor because he maintains political efficacy requires the consciousness of freedom. The people, Hegel said time and again, have not as yet achieved this consciousness. They are still lacking the knowledge of their true interest and constitute a rather passive element in the political process. The establishment of a rational society presupposes that the people have ceased to exist in the form of masses and have been transformed into an association of free individuals. National Socialism, in contrast, glorifies the masses and retains the people in their pre-rational natural condition. Even in this condition, however, the Volk is not allowed to play an active political role. Its political reality is supposed to be represented by the unique person of the leader, who is the source of all law and all right and the sole author of social and political existence. The German idealism that culminated in the Hegelian teaching asserted the conviction that social and political institutions should jibe with a free development of the individual. The authoritarian system, on the other hand, cannot maintain the life of its social order except by forcible conscription of every individual, regardless of his interest, into the economic process. The idea of individual welfare gives way to the demand for sacrifice. The duty of sacrifice for the whole has no limit if we regard the people as the highest good on earth. The authoritarian system cannot considerably or permanently raise the standard of living, nor can it enlarge the area and means of individual enjoyment. This would undermine its indispensable discipline and, in the last analysis, would annul the fascist order, which of its very nature must prevent any free development of productive forces. Consequently, fascism does not believe in the possibility of happiness on earth, and it denies the equation that well-being equals happiness. Today, when all the technical potentialities for an abundant life are at hand, the National Socialists consider the decline of the standard of living inevitable and indulge in panegyrics on impoverishment. The total victimization of the individual that takes place is encouraged for the specific benefit of the industrial and political bureaucracy. It therefore cannot be justified on the ground of the individual true interest. National Socialist ideology simply states that true human existence consists in unconditional sacrifice, that it is of the essence of the individual's life to obey and to serve, service which never comes to an end because service and life coincide. Ernst Krieg, one of National Socialism's representative spokesmen, devoted a considerable portion of his writing to a repudiation of German idealism. In his periodical Volk im Werden, he published an article called Der Deutsche Idealismus zwischen den Zeitaltern, in which the following sweeping declaration occurs. German idealism must be overcome in form and in content if we are to become a political and active nation. The reason for the condemnation is clear. German idealism protested the wholesale surrender of the individual to ruling social and political forces. Its exaltation of mind and its insistence on the significance of thought implied, National Socialism correctly saw an essential opposition to any victimization of the individual. Philosophic idealism was part and parcel of idealist culture, and this culture recognized a realm of truth that was not subject to the authority of the order that is and of the powers that be. Art, philosophy, and religion envisioned a world that challenged the claims of the given reality. Idealist culture is incompatible with fascist discipline and control. We live no longer in the age of education, culture, humanity, and pure spirit, but in the necessity for struggle, for political visions of reality, for soldiery, national discipline, for the national honor and future. It is therefore not the idealist, but the heroic attitude which is demanded of men as the task and need of life in this epoch. Kriek makes no attempt to point to any specific sins in the thought structure of German idealism, although a philosopher and holding Hegel's chair at the University of Heidelberg, he finds difficulty in coping with the simplest philosophical idea. We must turn for specific statements to those who, by profession, are still engaged in philosophical work. Franz Bohm's anti-Cartesianism, which offers the National Socialist interpretation of the history of philosophy, contains a chapter on Hegel and Were. Hegel is here made the symbol of all that National Socialism abhors and rejects. The emancipation from Hegel is hailed as forerunner of a return to true philosophy. For a century, Hegel's universalistic conception buried the motivations of the German history and philosophy. What is this anti-German orientation in Hegel? First, his stress on thought, his attack on action for action's sake. Bohm gets to the center of Hegelianism when he criticizes its humanitarian ideals. He recognizes the intrinsic connection between the notions of reason and mind and the universalistic conception of humanity. To view the world as mind, he says, and to measure existing forms according to reason's standard is tantamount in the end to transcending contingent and natural distinctions and conflicts among men and passing beyond these to the universal essence of man. It is tantamount to upholding the right of humanity as against the particular claims of politics. Reason implies the unity of all men as rational beings. When reason finally fulfills itself in freedom, the freedom is the possession of all men and the inalienable right of every individual. Idealistic universalism thus implies individualism. The National Socialist critique harps on the tendencies in Hegel's philosophy that contradict all totalitarianism. By virtue of these tendencies, it declares Hegel to be the symbol of a centuries-old superseded past and the philosophic counterwill of our time. Bohm's criticism recurs in a somewhat milder and more elaborate form in another representative document of the National Socialist philosophy, Hans Hesse's Idee und Existenz, which declares Hegel the source of all liberal, idealistic, as well as materialistic philosophies of history. The National Socialists, in contrast to many Marxists, take the connection between Hegel and Marx seriously. The fact that the development towards authoritarian forms was an about-face from Hegelian principles rather than any consequence of these was recognized within and outside of Germany as early as the period of the First World War. Muirhead in England declared at that time that it is not in Hegelianism, but in the violent reaction against the whole idealist philosophy that set in shortly after his death that we have to look for the philosophical foundations of present-day militarism. The statement holds with all its implications. The ideological roots of authoritarianism have their soil in the violent reaction against Hegel that styled itself the positive philosophy. The destruction of the principle of reason, the interpretation of society in terms of nature, and the subordination of thought to the inexorable dynamics of the given operated in the romanticist philosophy of the state, in the historical school, in Comte's sociology. These anti-Hegelian tendencies joined forces with the irrational philosophies of life, history, and existence that arose in the last decade of the 19th century and built the ideological framework for the assault on liberalism. The social and political theory responsible for the development of fascist Germany was, then, related to Hegelianism in a completely negative way. It was anti-Hegelian in all its aims and principles. No better witness to this fact exists than the one serious political theorist of National Socialism, Carl Schmitt. The first edition of his Begriff des Politischen raises the question of how long the spirit of Hegel lived in Berlin, and he replies, in any case, the school that became authoritative in Prussia after 1840 preferred to have the conservative philosophy of F.J. Stahl, while Hegel wandered from Karl Marx to Lenin and to Moscow. And he summarizes the entire process in the striking statement that on the day of Hitler's ascent to power, Hegel, so to speak, died.